In years with average rainfall, about 30% of our water supply comes from groundwater. That amount spikes to 40% of our water supply during dry years. Increasing demands from agriculture and a growing population, as well as an unreliable supply of water from other sources, has placed added burdens on our already overtaxed groundwater supply. And despite these growing pressures, California, unlike any other Western state, has no comprehensive statewide regulation of groundwater use. As a result, some argue that there's a disconnect between groundwater law and science, and that something has to be done to protect this vital part of our water supply. The question is what? We'll ask Anton Favorini-Csorba, a water policy expert with the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office, and Michelle Sneed from the U.S. Geological Survey's California Water Science Center. Groundwater pumping, a race to the bottom?
Additional funding for the Maddy Report made possible by a grant from Paramount Agricultural Companies, growing healthy food for you and your family.
From the California Channel at the state capitol, Valley PBS, and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. Today we're at the state capitol in Sacramento, and the issue is groundwater, the water beneath our feet. How dependent are we on it, and how is it being managed? Our guest is Anton Favorini-Csorba, who is a water policy expert with the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark.
So, why is groundwater relevant? How much does groundwater supply our overall water supply?
Groundwater is a major contributor to our water supply. About 75% of Californians get some portion of their water from groundwater, their drinking water. As a percentage of our overall water use, it's about 30% on average. In dry years like we're in right now, it increases to 40% or more.
That's pretty significant. So what role do you think groundwater is going to play in our future water needs?
Yeah, so groundwater is particularly important as kind of drought storage in drier years. The Department of Water Resources says that in the future we're going to have significantly higher demands for water overall in the future, particularly in dry years. And groundwater is one of the less expensive ways to meet that demand. So enhancing our groundwater management will definitely be an important part of that.
Yeah, there's this huge opportunity there with all the aquifers, if we could just fill them.
Well, that's right, yeah. And it's a combination of surface storage is important for helping fill groundwater. Groundwater is good because there's a lot of space there, but it takes a little bit of time to get water into the aquifers. Surface storage is good. You can capture it when it's running off and then slowly let it into the ground.
There's been obviously a big support in the valley for above ground storage dams. Right. A lot of people don't make the connection between above ground storage dams and
That's right.
underground groundwater. You're saying there's an absolute connection there.
There absolutely is. Yeah.
You know, California is interesting. It's one of two Western states without a comprehensive state-managed groundwater use permitting system. It kind of sounds like California is the Wild West of groundwater pumping.
It is a little bit, and actually at this point we are now the only Western state. Recently Texas was the last holdout, and so yeah, in California.
So they're even regulating it in Texas.
Yeah, there's some court cases, believe me, on that one. But yeah, so right now groundwater is presumed to belong to the landowner who overlies that basin, so they can drill a well. Sometimes they need a permit from the county, but otherwise it can be unregulated in some areas. Surface water is different. For surface water, you generally need a permit from the State Water Resources Control Board to take water out of a lake or a river.
It seems like water is water, though, and particularly since one affects the other, that why would you regulate one and not the other?
Yeah, I think you're getting to kind of there's something of a disconnect in our state law in terms of surface water and groundwater.
You know, I do want to ask you that you were mentioning about court decisions that are happening maybe in Texas. What about in California? Are there court decisions? You were mentioning maybe local ordinances that they do regulate groundwater use?
That's right. Certainly there are many parts of the state that locals are successfully managing their groundwater. And they do that either through a court adjudication, where essentially a court comes in and creates groundwater rights, or they'll have local regulations that ensure that groundwater is available to people in that area. So they might prohibit exporting the groundwater to another basin as a way of doing that.
But it's not that groundwater isn't regulated at all. I mean, there are federal and state agencies that regulate various aspects of groundwater. What are they and what do they do?
Yeah, that's right. Generally, the state role is to either support or provide incentives for local management of groundwater, and that's done through grants or loans in a lot of cases. The state also does a fair bit of monitoring of groundwater quality, but nothing really at this time on groundwater use, on who's using it.
So a focus on quality, not quantity.
That's right.
All right, but there has been some state legislation that's added some new monitoring requirements. What are they and how are they being enforced?
Yeah, so in 2009, the legislature passed a law that required local agencies, water districts, irrigation districts, to submit data in a standardized format on the level of groundwater, so how far underground the water table is. That's a pretty big step because right now we don't really have any sense of what the groundwater resource is. The local agencies that don't voluntarily submit that data will become ineligible for state grants and loans for water purposes.
So it's kind of a carrot there to get them to do that.
Right.
All right, when we come back, we're going to talk about the state of groundwater in the San Joaquin Valley in particular. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. How big a problem is groundwater overpumping, and should we be concerned about it? Our next guest is Michelle Sneed from the U.S. Geological Survey's California Water Science Center. That's a mouthful. And it's going to hopefully help explain the situation to us. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thanks for having me.
So, overpumping or overdrafting of groundwater, is that a new problem?
It's really not a new problem. It's been happening in California in different areas for a long time. We were massively overdrafting the Central Valley area in the mid-50s and 60s. But then when the California Aqueduct was built, the Delta-Mendota Canal was built, they started delivering surface water to those areas, and so groundwater pumping was greatly reduced because surface water was available.
So what about, California, unlike a lot of other western states, has no state standards on groundwater management. And some say the situation might even be worse in the Central Valley. What is the situation in the Central Valley?
In the Central Valley right now, groundwater levels are declining. So what that generally means is that more water is being taken out than is being replenished. And during a drought, less water is being replenished, less water is coming down the California Aqueduct and the Delta-Mendota Canal, and so groundwater pumping is used to make up for that deficit to keep the crops watered out in the fields.
So it's a double whammy. You're not getting rain, and you're not getting water from the reservoirs because they're not getting any snowpack runoff, so people are pumping more.
That's right. That happens during drought periods in some parts of the Central Valley. In other places in California, there's essentially more taken out every year than there is replenished in places like Borrego Springs, for instance. They have no access to surface water, so their entire supply comes from groundwater.
100%.
100%.
So what other things are happening in the valley that are contributing maybe to this issue? Why are they pumping so much in the valley?
Well, they're pumping so much
besides the fact they don't have water. Is it the crops? Is it housing developments? What's causing it?
Well, it's really largely agricultural. So, the San Joaquin Valley, the Central Valley in general, produces lots of food for the nation. So they need a lot of water to water those crops. And there's a couple of things happening. First of all, the demand has increased relative to the supply, and that is exacerbated during droughts. But in some places, like Madera County, where they have very little access to surface water, being in a drought or being in a wet year really is irrelevant to how much groundwater they're pumping. So to them, it doesn't really matter how much is coming down the canals or down rivers because they have no access to that.
So they're always going to pump.
They're always going to pump.
Is there any data out there to tell how much groundwater actually exists?
Well, what we use is measuring groundwater levels in wells. And then we incorporate that information to complex hydrologic models that simulate flow in the aquifer system and on the surface. So we use that data to constrain those models, to keep those models honest.
Well, okay, for a non-scientist like me, and probably some folks in our audience, let's make that a little simpler for them to understand, for me to understand. So, could you explain it maybe in another way? How do we know how much water is there? It sounds like it might be, frankly, a guesstimate.
It really is a guesstimate. This is water that you can't see, you can't directly measure. There aren't enough wells to really get a full picture. You know, those are the measurements we have, and they're spatially far apart. And the measurements are also infrequent in many places. So, and you also have to know where the bottom is, and that is difficult. You have to drill very deep, that's very expensive. People don't drill all the way to the bottom of the valley to get water. So it's a little bit nebulous about where that bottom is. And so how big is this pool? How big is this bathtub is always a question.
So we really
always
don't know,
are improving on that.
We really don't know how much is there, but do we have a better estimate on what is actually being pumped?
Well, it depends on where you are, but in the Central Valley, most agricultural pumps are not metered and not reported. And for us as scientists, this is a huge part of the supply for agricultural fields. And it's a number that we have to back out. So we try to measure all of the other components of supply and demand. And then essentially what is left, because we know what kind of crop it is, we know how much water it takes to grow that crop, and so we back that information out based on all the other data.
Wow, it's putting a lot of data together. Well, up next, some folks are getting that sinking feeling, literally, about overpumping of groundwater. We'll talk about subsidence when we return. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with Michelle Sneed with the U.S. Geological Survey's California Water Science Center. So what are the implications if overdrafting or groundwater goes unchecked?
Well, what we have been measuring is large swaths of land subsiding. And subsidence is caused by aquifer system compaction. So the aquifer system is getting thinner as a result of groundwater levels lowering.
So there's water in the aquifer.
Yes.
They're pumping the water out, and then what happens?
Well, most of compaction that is responsible for land subsidence occurs in clay units. Clays are different than sands and gravels because they're platy minerals. You can think about them as like tiny little pancakes. And when they are deposited, when clay is deposited, they're deposited in these random orientations. And there's lots of space between these pancakes, and that's where water is stored. When you start to lower groundwater levels from pumping or from any other process, when groundwater levels are lowered and they're lowered beyond this threshold, the clays will rearrange themselves into more like a stack of pancakes, and there's a lot less space between a stack of pancakes than randomly oriented pancakes. So not only does the volume get smaller, so the land subsides, but you also can't store as much water in the aquifer system now than you could before the compaction occurred.
So is subsidence reversible?
No, it's not reversible. So even if you brought water levels back up, recharged the aquifer system, those clay grains will not go back into random orientations. They will inflate a little bit, but still you will have a significant loss of storage capacity in the system, and the land will not come back up.
I had read somewhere that was about 15 or 20% on average loss of storage space, but you're saying it perhaps is more than that?
No, I'd say that's probably about right for most systems. We really haven't done the work necessary to determine how much storage is lost in many systems. Those are expensive studies to undertake, so we've only done that in a few areas.
But the magnitude of groundwater, in California is incredible. It's much more than surface storage, and by a multiple of what, 10?
That's a good question. I'm not sure exactly the relative size of availability of surface water and groundwater, but with groundwater, you have to remember, as groundwater levels lower, it's more expensive to pump. You also, in some areas, deeper sediments, especially in desert basins, tend to be higher in arsenic. And so as you're now drawing water from deeper in the basin, the water quality may start to degrade. So that's another problem. You may even start to introduce salt water if you're close to the coast.
Okay, so what are local jurisdictions doing to address this problem?
Well, some are quite proactive. The Central California Irrigation District is one of those. They're out in the Madera area, and they are working with farmers to try to find alternatives. And really the alternative is finding more water, a different water supply. So they're working amongst each other, trying to sort of move around pumping from one farm to another to see how that works. One of the problems is we really don't have the measurement systems in place to gauge how these actions are really going to affect the system.
So from a scientific perspective, what do you think can be done to address this concern?
Well, really the magic bullet is to not lower groundwater levels beyond that threshold I was talking about where these clay particles rearrange themselves.
Do we have an actual number for that?
In many places we do, yes, and it typically is the previous lowest groundwater level. So if we're going to lower groundwater levels beyond their previous low historically, that's when we start to induce subsidence. If we keep groundwater levels above that threshold, then the threat and risk from subsidence is much, much less.
But isn't this all interrelated? In other words, surface storage also impacts groundwater. So if we had more surface storage, more dams, we could use that maybe to help regenerate the water in the aquifers.
Yeah, really any new sources of water that we can manage. Aquifer systems are also great storage systems. So not only surface water storage, but we need to start thinking more about groundwater storage. And some places in the southern end of the San Joaquin Valley are doing that. In Kern County, there's large programs where they have these large ponds, and when the water's available, so we have big storms and water's coming down the Kern River, they capture that water, they put it in these ponds, and they let it percolate down into the aquifer system to help recharge the system. So that sort of balances them a little bit better down there.
And maybe issues like gray water, reusing water instead of just letting it go away. That might be another idea to kind of
Yeah,
recapture.
recycled water. Many
Recycled
places do that. You see out in Antelope Valley, for instance, you see what we call purple pipes. And those are recycled water, and they color them purple so that people don't drink out of them. But that's another great source.
We may be seeing purple pipes in our future. Well, I want to thank Michelle Sneed from the California Water Science Center at the USGS. Up next, what are the issues and challenges with groundwater management? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're rejoined by Anton Favorini-Csorba from the LAO's office, who's their water expert there. In a recent report, you stated that, quote, there was a disconnect between groundwater law and science, unquote. How so?
Yeah, that's right. So hydrologic science shows that groundwater and surface water are very much physically connected. So for instance, in the San Joaquin Valley, it used to be that many of the rivers there would gain water as they flowed downstream because the groundwater table was so high. The groundwater would actually be adding to the rivers. That doesn't happen anymore because we've drained or lowered the level of the aquifers at that point, which means we're actually taking some of the water out of the rivers. State law separates surface waters from what they call percolating groundwater, the water that's in the pores and in the soil.
And we were talking about earlier, these are all interconnected. Surface storage, groundwater, they're all connected. You also mentioned in your report that, quote, gaps in groundwater management complicate statewide water planning, unquote. What gaps are you talking about?
Yeah, I think the biggest gap is right now we don't have any comprehensive data on really even the quality, but especially the use of groundwater in the state. We don't know who's using it. Oftentimes the Department of Water Resources actually has to kind of back out calculations of groundwater use from other data. And the challenge that introduces is when we're looking forward and trying to plan our water future as a state without a good sense of how much groundwater we have and the rate at which we're using it, it can be very difficult to plan for the future.
You know, there's also a lot of talk about groundwater contamination. How does that impact groundwater supply, and what is the cost to clean it up?
Yeah, contamination can have a significant impact on groundwater supplies because oftentimes if a well becomes contaminated, you have to close that well and you lose that as a source of supply. We don't always know at the state level when that occurs. You certainly can treat groundwater or blend it, but that can be very expensive, particularly if you're a small or disadvantaged community. As far as cleaning up goes, that's actually even more expensive in a lot of cases than treatment. A UC Davis report recently came out, or a year or two ago, that said cleaning up nitrate contamination in the Central Valley, the cost would be on the order of a couple $2 billion a year or more.
A year?
Yeah.
Okay, well the governor has taken, moving forward a little bit on some of the monitoring of groundwater. He includes $1.9 million in his current budget for overdraft management. How big a problem is overdrafting, and will $1.9 million address the problem?
Yeah, so I would say first, we don't have a great sense of the full scale of overdraft. The Department of Water Resources estimates that we're overdrafting by 1.5 million acre feet a year, and that is the amount of water that about 3 million households might use in a year. So it's even that estimate is a significant amount.
So we're overdrafting. In other words, it's like a bank account. We're draining the bank account.
That's right. We're taking out more than flows in naturally, or we're putting back in place.
Okay. The governor also has $2.9 million in his budget for groundwater elevation monitoring. Can you explain that?
Yeah, and so that relates to the 2009 legislation that I mentioned earlier, which is, this is just monitoring. It's again trying to look at how far below the surface of the ground is the groundwater table, and how is that changing over time.
Okay, so are there any standards for groundwater elevation that it should be at this level? And if not, okay, how would they enforce it? So they have the number, and then what?
Right. Well, that's the big question. Right now, this proposal is just to monitor the overdraft management proposal that you mentioned before. In theory, could ultimately result in some regulation of groundwater management. There's a lot of details that need to be worked out there.
Well, your office, the Legislative Analyst Office, has made several recommendations to improve groundwater management. What are they?
Yeah, so the first one would be to establish a more comprehensive system of monitoring, particularly of groundwater use in the state. And so in that case, you'd require local water districts or other local agencies to report their groundwater use in some standardized format. That would allow us to integrate that into some of our state water planning decisions. The second recommendation would be to, in areas where we see that there's high potential for overdraft or contamination, we should put into place some sort of institution that would essentially regulate groundwater extraction in those areas.
That necessarily doesn't have to be at the state level. It could be at the local level.
That's right. There's definitely a place for local control there in terms of how do you want the basin to look in the future. There may be parts of the state where we don't necessarily we could take more out than we are putting back in, but in others you might want to manage it differently.
Well, I want to thank Anton Favorini-Csorba with the State Legislative Analyst Office, as well as Michelle Sneed from the U.S. Geological Survey's California Water Science Center for joining us. If you want to stay current on local and state politics, you can sign up for our free and award-winning e-newsletter, The Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. And now, another perspective.
Groundwater is our water savings account in California. In many areas of the San Joaquin Valley, the savings account has been declining substantially in the last 30 years. In some locations, it is at a point where the overdraft of the account is literally impacting the structure of the bank. The structural change is called subsidence. Subsidence involves part of the deep basement collapsing, which then translates all the way to the top of the structure. Subsidence causes the surface of the land to sink, which then causes havoc with nearby structures such as roads, bridges, canals, pipelines, and natural waterways. Groundwater is locally managed, and it needs more of our attention in order for it to remain a useful source of water. Local management includes improving replacement of pumped water, which is called recharge. Local management may also require less pumping in some areas to control subsidence. Local management may also require investments in more surface water storage and improved conveyance to get wet year water into the ground in the best locations. If we do not manage our groundwater locally, it is apparent that state government is ready and willing to control it for us, and the result could be a prohibition of pumping in some areas such as those with subsidence. The current drought has brought forth numerous water management issues, and groundwater use is no exception. The reality is that it has taken us a while to get into the current condition with groundwater, and it will likely take us as long to recover from the problems. Be prepared for a journey, not an event.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy.
This is Mark Kepler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.